Today, we're going to trace the incredible story of how a single idea, born on the absolute fringes of the Roman Empire, grew into the institution that would go on to define an entire continent. This is the journey of Christianity, from a persecuted sect to a world-shaping force. And that's the central question we're tackling, isn't it? How on earth did a small, often outlawed faith not only survive one of the most powerful empires in history, but eventually take its place to build the very foundation of modern Europe? It's an amazing story of theology, politics, and, of course, power. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the early movement, see how it became the official religion of Rome, then look at the first major crack, the Great Schism, and finally, dive into the massive upheaval of the Reformation. So let's get right to it, back at the beginning. Okay, so every big story has to start somewhere, and this one doesn't begin with an emperor or an army, but with a radical spark. Christianity didn't just appear out of nowhere, it grew out of the traditions of Second Temple Judaism, offering a brand new take on ancient beliefs right in the middle of the sprawling Roman Empire. Now, the really foundational concept here is monotheism. You have to remember, the Roman world was full of gods, a god for war, a god for the harvest, you name it. So the Jewish belief in a single, all-powerful God, that was a pretty revolutionary idea, and it became the absolute bedrock for Christianity. At its heart, the message that Jesus taught was centered on really simple, powerful ideas: love, compassion, and the promise of salvation. Now, think about Roman society. It was rigid, it was hierarchical. So this message that everyone had inherent worth and a path to an afterlife had this incredible appeal, especially to the poor, to the enslaved, and to women.
And the early growth of this movement was really driven by two key figures. You have Peter, who led the original apostles back in Jerusalem, keeping the faith strong among its first Jewish followers. But then you have Paul, and Paul was the real game changer. He argued that this message was for everyone, and his journeys across the empire took this new faith to non-Jewish communities, turning it into a truly international movement.
But of course, this kind of growth doesn't go unnoticed. The Romans saw the Christians' refusal to worship the state gods as basically an act of treason, and this led to terrible waves of persecution. But that brings up a really interesting paradox, right? Why did this effort to crush the movement actually end up making it stronger? Because that's exactly what happened. Against all the odds, the movement just kept growing under pressure, and this set the stage for one of the most incredible turnarounds in all of history, the moment this persecuted little cult became the official religion of the very empire that tried to stamp it out. And the change happened incredibly fast. I mean, just look at this timeline. In the early 300s, Emperor Constantine converts, giving it the stamp of imperial approval. Then, in 325, the Council of Nicaea starts to standardize what everyone believes. And by the end of that same century, boom, it's the official state religion. In less than a single lifetime, the faith went from the catacombs right to the throne. So that Council of Nicaea, its main goal was to get everyone on the same page, to create a single, unified Christian belief system. And its most important product was the Nicene Creed. This statement of faith finally settled a huge debate about the nature of Jesus by declaring him to be both fully human and fully divine. This became a core foundational doctrine of the faith. And with that, the line between church and state it basically vanished. Religion wasn't just a personal belief anymore. It was now welded to imperial authority and political power. This fusion of the cross and the crown would end up defining Europe for the next 1,000 years. But, as we know, a single unified Christian empire just couldn't hold together forever. For centuries, deep cultural and political differences were slowly pulling the church in two different directions, and that led to the first major fracture in its foundation. You basically had two very different centers of power developing. In the West, you had the church centered in Rome. It spoke Latin, and it was led by the Pope. Meanwhile, in the East, the church was based in Constantinople. It used Greek, and it was led by the Patriarch. Over time, these differences in language, leadership, and just general culture created two separate worlds, all within the same faith. And in the year 1054, things finally reached a breaking point. After centuries of simmering tensions, the leaders of the Eastern and Western churches pretty much excommunicated each other. This formal, dramatic split is what we now call the Great Schism. So what was the result? Well, two distinct branches of Christianity now existed: the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. And this wasn't just some theological squabble. It carved a deep cultural and political fault line right through Europe that, honestly, you can still see today. Okay, let's fast forward about 500 years. By this point, the Western Catholic Church had become incredibly powerful. But with that power came charges of corruption and growing resentment, which set the stage for the next gigantic crack in Christianity's foundation. By the early 1500s, a lot of people were getting really unhappy. The church was criticized for its massive wealth, its meddling in politics, and especially for selling these things called indulgences, basically certificates that promise to get you or your loved ones out of purgatory faster. The ground was definitely fertile for a revolution. And that revolution was kicked off by this single number, 95. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. It was a list of arguments against the church's practices, and legend has it he nailed it to a church door, setting a fire that would spread across all of Europe. At the very heart of Luther's argument was this one explosive idea. He said that a person's salvation comes directly from their faith in God, not from rituals, not from payments, and not from the authority of the church. I mean, this was a direct challenge to the Pope's power, and it kicked off what we now call the Protestant Reformation. But the Reformation wasn't just about theology. It was hugely political. Just look at England. King Henry VIII wanted a divorce. The Pope said no, so Henry just broke away from Rome entirely. He created his own National Church of England, and in doing so, he showed that monarchs could now just seize control of religion within their own kingdoms. So, after more than 1,000 years as this massive, unified institution, even with its East-West divide, Christianity's foundation in Europe was now completely and totally fractured. So let's take a look at the legacy of all these shifts. The end result was this permanent fragmentation of Christianity in the West. Europe was no longer a single solid Catholic bloc. It was now this complex, messy patchwork of Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and all these new Protestant groups like Lutherans and Anglicans. So what's the ultimate takeaway from all this? It's pretty clear. This incredible 1,500-year journey shows how one religion fundamentally built European civilization. It was the framework for political power. It was the mold for cultural identity. And tragically, it was also the source of deep, lasting divisions and conflicts whose echoes we can still hear today. And all of this history really pushes us to look at our own world and ask one last question. When you see this long legacy of fusion, fracture, and influence, it makes you wonder, how does religion continue to draw the lines of politics, culture, and identity in our societies today?